On October 26, 1918, Colonel Alfred Wainwright Bloor of the 142nd Infantry Regiment, 36th Division, faced an impossible situation in the forests of northeastern France. The Germans were intercepting every field telephone transmission. They were reading American battle plans as fast as American commanders could issue them. Conventional codes were useless, taking too long to encrypt and decode under fire. And when speed wasn't the problem, security was. The Germans had broken every cipher the Americans had tried. Bloor had watched his regiment get torn apart at Saint-Étienne just 18 days earlier. 8 officers and 111 men killed in a single day of combat, their first taste of war. The Germans had known they were coming. They always knew. But Bloor had noticed something during the weeks of training and fighting. Among the men of the 142nd Infantry were soldiers from 26 different Native American tribes. And the previous day, he had overheard 2 soldiers from Company E, Choctaw men from southeastern Oklahoma, speaking to each other in their native tongue. He couldn't understand a single word. And if he couldn't understand them, neither could the Germans. That realization, born of desperation in the forests of France, would change military communications forever. The Choctaw soldiers of Company E, 142nd Infantry Regiment, were about to become America's first code talkers, pioneers of a communication technique that would remain unbroken through 2 world wars and prove decisive in some of the most critical battles in American military history. By late October 1918, the American Expeditionary Force was locked in what would become the deadliest campaign in United States military history, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The massive Allied push had been grinding forward since September 26th, involving over 1.2 million American troops alongside French forces in an assault designed to break the Hindenburg Line and end the war. The 36th Infantry Division, comprised primarily of Texas and Oklahoma National Guardsmen, had arrived at the front in early October. They were part of the French Fourth Army, operating in the Champagne sector, advancing through heavily fortified German positions between the Argonne Forest and the Aisne River. The terrain was a nightmare. Dense forests, ravines, and hills that the Germans had spent 4 years fortifying. Machine gun nests were hidden in every tree line. Artillery positions commanded every approach. And the Germans had one additional advantage that made Allied advances extraordinarily costly. They were listening to everything. German intelligence units had become extraordinarily proficient at intercepting Allied communications. They tapped telephone lines, used listening devices to capture radio transmissions, and employed fluent English speakers to monitor American field communications. Within hours of intercepting a message, German commanders would know American troop positions, planned attacks, supply routes, and reinforcement schedules. The result was devastating. American units would prepare for what they thought were surprise attacks, only to find Germans waiting in prepared positions with concentrated artillery already ranged on their approach routes. Casualty rates soared. Tactical surprise became impossible. For the 142nd Infantry Regiment, this communication problem had contributed directly to the massacre at Saint-Étienne. On October 8, 1918, in their first major engagement, the regiment had attacked German positions near the village of Saint-Étienne-à-Aisne. The assault had failed catastrophically. German defenders, forewarned by intercepted communications, had reinforced their positions and prepared devastating fields of fire. The 142nd suffered 119 killed and over 400 wounded in a single day, more than 20% casualties in their first battle. Colonel Bloor knew something had to change. Traditional encryption methods were too slow for tactical communications in fluid combat situations. By the time messages could be encoded, transmitted, and decoded, the battlefield situation had often changed completely.
Field telephones offered the fastest communication, but they were hopelessly vulnerable to interception. And then Bloor overheard those two Choctaw soldiers talking. The young men who would become America's first code talkers came from a people who had already survived centuries of displacement, broken treaties, and systematic attempts to erase their culture. The Choctaw were one of the largest Native American nations in the southeastern United States, with traditional homelands in what would become Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. They had developed a sophisticated agricultural society with complex political structures, maintained extensive trade networks, and had their own rich oral tradition and language that had evolved over thousands of years. In the 1830s, the Choctaw became the first nation forced to walk the Trail of Tears. Under the Indian Removal Act of 1830, they were expelled from their ancestral lands and relocated to Indian Territory, what would eventually become Oklahoma. The journey was devastating. Of approximately 15,000 Choctaws who were forced to march westward, an estimated 2,500 died from disease, starvation, and exposure. But the Choctaw persevered. In Indian Territory, they re-established their nation, creating a functioning government with a written constitution, a bicameral legislature, and an extensive school system. The Choctaw Nation built academies and schools throughout their territory: Spencer Academy, Armstrong Academy, Wheelock Seminary, and others, providing education to thousands of Choctaw children. However, these schools reflected a painful duality. While some were established by the Choctaw themselves to preserve and strengthen their community, others, particularly those run by missionaries and later by the federal government, had a different mission entirely: cultural eradication. The boarding school system that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries operated under a philosophy articulated by Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School: "Kill the Indian, save the man." Children as young as 5 were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools where everything about their identity was systematically attacked. Students arriving at these schools had their hair cut short, were given English names, dressed in Western clothing, and forbidden, under threat of severe punishment, from speaking their native languages. The punishment for speaking Choctaw could be brutal: beatings with sticks, rulers, and belts, having their mouths washed out with soap, solitary confinement, or being forced to kneel on hard surfaces for hours. Some students recalled being made to scrub their skin with harsh bristle brushes until it was raw, in an attempt to literally wash away their indigenous identity. "We were spanked for speaking our language," recalled Wilson Roberts, a Choctaw boarding school survivor who attended in the 1940s. Not spankings, beatings, actually. Students learned to look over their shoulders before speaking their own language, a habit that persisted into adulthood, even decades after they left the schools. The irony of what would happen in France in 1918 cannot be overstated. The same government that had spent decades punishing Choctaw children for speaking their language was about to beg Choctaw soldiers to use that language to save American lives. The Choctaw soldiers of the 142nd Infantry Regiment came from small towns and rural communities scattered across southeastern Oklahoma, places like Hoe, Bennington, Hochatown, Smithville, and Atoka. Most had grown up speaking Choctaw as their first language, learning English only when they attended the mandatory schools. Despite everything their people had endured, the Trail of Tears, the broken treaties, the boarding schools, the second-class citizenship, when the United States entered World War I in April 1917, Choctaw men volunteered for military service in remarkable numbers. They weren't yet citizens. Native Americans wouldn't receive full citizenship until 1924, but they enlisted anyway. Their motivations were complex and deeply personal. Some saw military service as a way to prove themselves as Americans. Others were continuing a warrior tradition that stretched back countless generations in Choctaw culture. Many simply felt it was their duty to defend the land their people now called home, even if that nation hadn't always defended them. Among the Choctaw who enlisted were men whose names would become part of military history. Albert Billy, born in 1885 in Ho, a full-blood Choctaw who would become one of the original Code Talkers. Solomon Bond Lewis, born in 1988 in Hochatown, who at 20 years old would find his fluency in both Choctaw and English suddenly crucial to military operations. Mitchell Bob, from Rufie in the Indian Territory, who joined Company E and would use his language to transmit tactical orders under fire. Joseph Oklahomby, whose Choctaw name literally meant man-killer or people-killer, who would become one of the most decorated soldiers from Oklahoma. In addition to serving as a code talker, Oklahomby would single-handedly capture 171 German soldiers and kill 79 others in a cemetery near Saint-Étienne, trapping them behind high walls and fighting for 4 days until they surrendered. For this action, he would receive the Croix de Guerre from France. Ben Hampton, James Edwards, Tobias Frazier, Victor Brown, Calvin Wilson, Pete Maytubby, Robert Taylor, Otis Leader, and others, young men in their 20s and early 30s who had grown up in the Choctaw Nation and spoke their language fluently. Captain E. W. Horner commanded Company E of the 142nd Infantry Regiment. His company was unusual. It included Native American soldiers from 14 different tribes, though the majority were Choctaw. This diversity reflected the demographics of Oklahoma, which had become home to numerous relocated tribes over the previous century. These men trained at Camp Bowie, Texas, in the blazing heat of 1917 and early 1918. They drilled with Springfield rifles, practiced trench warfare tactics, learned to use gas masks, and endured the grueling transformation from civilians into soldiers. In July 1918, the 142nd Infantry Regiment shipped out from New York, bound for France. They arrived in August 1918, just as the great Allied offensives of the war's final months were beginning. After a brief period of acclimatization and final training, they were assigned to the French Fourth Army and moved toward the front lines in the Champagne sector.
After the disaster at Saint-Étienne and nearly 3 weeks of brutal fighting, Colonel Bloor was desperate for any advantage. The Germans continued to intercept American communications, and every tactical plan seemed to be anticipated before it could be executed. On October 26th, Bloor's regiment faced a delicate tactical situation. 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion were positioned near the village of Choufili, but intelligence indicated that German forces were preparing to encircle them. The companies needed to withdraw to new positions near Chardonnay under cover of darkness, a movement that would leave the already depleted 3rd Battalion temporarily exposed and vulnerable. This was exactly the kind of operation where intercepted communications could prove catastrophic. If the Germans learned of the withdrawal, they could attack the moving companies while they were most vulnerable, or assault the 3rd Battalion while it stood alone. Dozens, possibly hundreds of American soldiers could die. Bloor made his decision. He called for soldiers from Company E who could speak Choctaw fluently. Captain Horner identified 8 men, educated Choctaws who were fully bilingual and could serve as translators while also operating field telephones. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Choctaw soldiers would be stationed at battalion headquarters and at key command posts along the line. They would receive orders in English, translate them into Choctaw, transmit them via field telephone to other Choctaw soldiers at receiving stations, who would then translate the messages back into English for the officers there. That night, as darkness fell over the forests of France, the first Choctaw Code Talker transmissions went out over American field telephone lines.
The withdrawal orders were transmitted in Choctaw. The two companies received their instructions, understood them perfectly, and began their movement. The Germans, listening as always on their tapped lines, heard nothing they could understand. The intercepted sounds were completely unlike any language they had encountered. They couldn't identify it, couldn't translate it, couldn't even begin to guess at its meaning. The withdrawal was completed without a single casualty. The Germans, completely in the dark about American movements, never launched the anticipated attack.
The success of the October 26th test convinced Colonel Bloor that the Choctaw Code Talkers could be decisive. But he wanted more than just secure communications for defensive movements. He wanted to use this advantage for offensive operations. The next test came just hours later, on October 27, 1918, at a German strongpoint called Forest Ferme. Forest Ferme was a fortified German position on a high peninsula of land overlooking the Aisne River. The Germans had occupied this ground for years, building an elaborate defensive network of trenches, machine gun positions, and artillery emplacements. Two previous French attacks on the position had failed with heavy casualties. The 36th Division was ordered to take Forest Ferme as part of the larger Allied offensive pushing toward the Aisne. This would be the 142nd Infantry Regiment's chance to redeem themselves after Saint-Étienne. Colonel Bloor planned a coordinated attack using a walking artillery barrage, a technique where infantry advanced closely behind a creeping barrage of artillery fire that moved forward at a predetermined pace, suppressing enemy defenses just ahead of the advancing troops. This required split-second timing and constant communication between infantry commanders and artillery units. It was exactly the kind of operation where secure, instant communication was essential. Throughout October 27th, Choctaw Code Talkers transmitted the detailed coordination instructions. Artillery firing schedules, infantry jump-off times, sector boundaries, and timing adjustments all were sent in Choctaw over field telephone lines. The Germans intercepted the transmissions, but they might as well have been listening to silence. They had no warning of what was coming. At the designated hour, the American artillery barrage began. The 142nd Infantry advanced behind the wall of explosions, moving rapidly through the German defensive positions. The Germans, caught completely by surprise, attempted to mount a defense, but were overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of the American attack. Forest Ferme fell in less than an hour. The 142nd Infantry captured the position with minimal casualties, just 8 men killed and 16 wounded, an astonishingly low number for an assault on such heavily fortified ground. The complete surprise of the German defenders provided clear evidence. The Choctaw Code was unbreakable. The enemy couldn't decipher the messages, couldn't even identify the language being spoken.
After Forest Ferme, the 142nd Infantry was pulled from the front lines for rest and reorganization. They moved to the village of Loupy-le-Petit, where they would remain until the war's end on November 11th, just 2 weeks away. During this period, Colonel Bloor ordered that the Choctaw Code Talker system be formalized and expanded. Several Choctaw soldiers were detailed for intensive training in transmitting military messages by telephone. The training was overseen by the regiment's liaison officer, Lieutenant Black, working closely with the Choctaw soldiers themselves. The challenge they faced was significant. The Choctaw language, like most Native American languages, had evolved for thousands of years in a very different context than modern industrial warfare. There were no Choctaw words for tank, machine gun, artillery battery, or battalion. The language simply hadn't needed them. The solution the Choctaw Code Talkers developed was both practical and poetic. They created code terms using existing Choctaw words that made logical sense, forming metaphorical descriptions that would be meaningful to other Choctaw speakers, but completely opaque to anyone intercepting the transmissions. Big gun in Choctaw became the code for artillery. Little gun shoot fast meant machine gun. Scalps was used for casualties. Battalions were indicated by 1 grain of corn, 2 grains of corn, and 3 grains of corn. Twice big group meant battalion in another iteration of the code. 8 group referred to a squad. The code terms were simple enough to be remembered easily, but specific enough to convey precise military information, and they worked because they were rooted in a language that had no written form, no dictionaries, and no scholars studying it outside the Choctaw community itself. James Edwards, one of the code talkers, played a particularly important role in developing the code vocabulary. He worked to identify which existing Choctaw words could be adapted for military terminology and created the standardized translations that all the code talkers would use. By early November 1918, the Choctaw Code Talker system was fully operational, with trained code talkers ready to support future operations. There were approximately 18 to 19 Choctaw soldiers serving as code talkers across the 142nd and 143rd Infantry Regiments of the 36th Division. But they would never get the chance to use their code again in combat. On November 11, 1918, the armistice went into effect. The war was over.
In January 1919, Colonel Bloor wrote an official memorandum to 36th Division Headquarters documenting the use of Choctaw Code Talkers. His report was clinical and factual, describing how the code had been implemented and its results. The first use of the Indians was made in ordering a delicate withdrawal of 2 companies of the 2nd Bean from Chufali to Chardney on the night of October 26th. This movement was completed without mishap. The Indians were used repeatedly on the 27th in preparation for the assault on Forest Firm. The enemy's complete surprise is evidence that he could not decipher the messages. Bloor's memorandum also noted the practical advantages. The vocabulary of the Indian is very limited. He has no knowledge of terms used in modern war, such as artillery preparation, machine gun barrage, liaison, etc. This in itself complicates the work of the Germans and renders the thing perfectly safe. The report was filed away in the archives of the American Expeditionary Force. A brief mention appeared in some newspapers when soldiers returned from France in 1919. A few military historians took note of the innovation. But there was no official recognition, no medals, no celebration of what these men had accomplished. The Choctaw Code Talkers returned home to Oklahoma as quietly as they had left. Many returned to farming, to families, to the lives they had left behind. Some struggled with what they had experienced, the trauma of combat, the loss of friends, the psychological wounds that wouldn't fully be understood for generations. Joseph Oklahamby returned to Wright City, Oklahoma, where he lived with his wife and son. Despite being offered a role in a Hollywood war movie, he refused to leave Oklahoma. He worked various jobs and became a respected figure in his community. On April 13, 1960, he was struck and killed by a truck as he walked along a road. He was buried with military honors in the Yashau Cemetery. Victor Brown, who was wounded and gassed with mustard gas during the war, received a citation from President Woodrow Wilson for his service. He was proud, his daughter later recalled, of fooling the Germans with the Choctaw language. After the war, he became an auditor for the IRS and later worked as a deputy state examiner for the state of Oklahoma. Others simply disappeared into history. Many of the Choctaw Code Talkers' full stories were never recorded.
Their families knew they had served, but often didn't know the details of what they had done in France, and the men themselves spoke little about it. For decades, the Choctaw Code Talkers were almost completely forgotten. The military kept no special records of their service. Their innovation was noted in a few military reports, but never formally studied or celebrated. Unlike later Code Talker programs, particularly the famous Navajo Code Talkers of World War II, the Choctaw received no special recognition during their lifetimes. Part of this was timing. When they returned from France in 1919, America was exhausted by war and eager to return to normalcy. The story of Native American soldiers using their primitive language to confuse Germans didn't fit neatly into the narratives of American technological and cultural superiority that dominated the era. Part of it was also the prevailing attitudes toward Native Americans. Despite their military service, the Choctaw Code Talkers returned home to a nation that still treated them as second-class citizens. They couldn't vote in state elections in Oklahoma until 1924, when the Indian Citizenship Act finally granted full citizenship to Native Americans born in the United States. Even then, some states continued to deny Native Americans voting rights for decades. The boarding schools continued to operate, continuing to punish Native children for speaking their languages. The campaign to erase indigenous cultures continued unabated. The men who had saved American lives with their language returned to a country where their children would be beaten for speaking that same language.
What the military did remember from the Choctaw experiment was this: Native American languages could provide virtually unbreakable codes for tactical military communications. The concept, pioneered by the Choctaw in October 1918, was studied by military intelligence officers in the years between the wars. Reports on the Choctaw Code Talkers were reviewed and filed away, waiting for the moment they might be needed again. That moment came in 1942. When the United States entered World War II, military planners remembered the success of the Choctaw Code Talkers from the previous war. They recognized that the concept could be expanded and systematized for the new conflict. The Marine Corps recruited Navajo Code Talkers, the most famous of all the Code Talker programs, starting with the legendary First 29 in 1942. The Navajo Code would be used throughout the Pacific Theater and would prove just as unbreakable as the Choctaw Code had been. But the Navajo weren't alone. The Army recruited Code Talkers from the Comanche, Choctaw again, Meskwaki, Fox, Hopi, Cherokee, and numerous other tribes. Comanche Code Talkers served in Europe, landing at Utah Beach on D-Day and fighting through France and Germany. Cherokee Code Talkers served in the Pacific. In total, soldiers from at least 14 different Native nations served as Code Talkers during World War II. Every single one of these programs traced its lineage back to those Choctaw soldiers in the forests of France in October 1918. They had proved the concept. They had demonstrated that Native American languages, far from being primitive relics to be discarded, possessed sophisticated structures that could be adapted for modern military applications in ways that defeated even the most advanced cryptographic efforts of enemy intelligence services. For more than 60 years, the Choctaw Code Talkers of World War I received no formal recognition for their service. They had saved American lives, helped win crucial battles, and pioneered a communication technique that would be used in 2 world wars. Yet they returned home to obscurity. The recognition, when it finally came, was slow and incomplete. In 1986, the Choctaw Nation established its own medal and memorial to honor the World War I Code Talkers. It was a tribal recognition, coming from their own people, decades after the fact.
In 1989, the government of France presented the Choctaw Nation with the Chevalier de l'Ordre National du Mérite in recognition of the Code Talkers' contributions to the Allied victory in France during World War I. The ceremony was held at the Oklahoma State Capitol on November 3, 1989, 71 years after Forrest Firm. But it wasn't until 2013 that the United States Congress finally acted. The Code Talkers Recognition Act authorized congressional gold medals for code talkers from all tribes who served in World Wars I and II. The legislation acknowledged that soldiers from the Choctaw, Cherokee, Comanche, Lakota, Meskwaki, Mohawk, Tlingit, and 25 other Native nations had served as code talkers. On November 23, 2013, a ceremony was held at the United States Capitol and the National Museum of the American Indian. The Choctaw Nation received a Congressional Gold Medal recognizing the collective service of all Choctaw code talkers. Families of individual code talkers received Congressional Silver Medals. By then, every single one of the original World War I Choctaw code talkers had passed away. Not one of them lived to see this recognition from their country. They had carried their secret to their graves, most dying without ever receiving official thanks for what they had done.
The story of the Choctaw Code Talkers is a story of profound ironies. Young men who had been punished for speaking their language were asked to use that language to save the nation that had punished them. A people who had been forcibly removed from their ancestral lands volunteered in remarkable numbers to defend the land to which they'd been exiled. Soldiers who weren't yet full citizens of the United States served in its military and helped win its wars. A language that government policy sought to erase proved more sophisticated than any encryption technology of its era. It is also a story about the resilience of indigenous cultures. Despite centuries of colonization, despite the Trail of Tears, despite the boarding schools and the systematic attempts at cultural genocide, the Choctaw language survived. It survived because the Choctaw people refused to let it die, speaking it in their homes, teaching it to their children when they could, maintaining their identity in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate. And when the moment came, that survival proved decisive. The language that had endured became a weapon, not of conquest, but of liberation. The ancient tongue that carried the history, wisdom, and identity of the Choctaw people also carried the tactical orders that turned the tide of battle at Forrest Firm. The Germans never broke the code. After the war, captured German intelligence officers were interrogated about their cryptographic efforts. They confirmed that they had intercepted the Choctaw transmissions, but had never been able to identify the language, much less translate it. To the end, the code remained a mystery to them. The same would be true in World War II. The Japanese, despite their skill at breaking American military codes, never cracked the Navajo Code or any of the other Native American codes used by American forces. Lieutenant General Seizo Aresue, Chief of Intelligence for the Imperial Japanese Army, confirmed after the war that while they had broken Army and Army Air Force codes, they had never broken the Marine Corps codes, the codes based on the Navajo language. The unbreakable codes of World War II can be traced directly back to those October nights in 1918 when Choctaw soldiers first spoke into field telephones in the forests of France. In the 21st century, the Choctaw Nation continues to honor its code talkers. The Tribal Museum in Durant, Oklahoma, features exhibits on their service. Annual ceremonies remember their sacrifice. Educational programs teach young Choctaw about this chapter of their history. But the story of the Code Talkers has also become part of a larger struggle, the fight to preserve the Choctaw language itself. Like many indigenous languages worldwide, Choctaw faces an uncertain future.
While it remains one of the more widely spoken Native American languages, with thousands of speakers, the number of fluent speakers decreases each year. Younger generations, growing up in a world dominated by English and digital media, often don't learn Choctaw as their first language. Elders die, taking with them knowledge that exists nowhere else. The Choctaw Nation has launched ambitious language revitalization programs. Immersion schools teach children all subjects in Choctaw. Language preservation projects record elders speaking the language, documenting vocabulary, idioms, and oral traditions before they're lost. Apps and online resources make Choctaw language learning accessible to tribal members wherever they live. And increasingly, these programs invoke the code talkers as inspiration. The message is clear and powerful. This language helped America win 2 world wars. This language proved more sophisticated than any encryption technology of its time. This language is worth preserving. The irony remains sharp. The government that once punished Native children for speaking Choctaw now funds programs to keep the language alive. The schools that tried to erase indigenous languages are replaced by schools trying to revive them. The code talkers serve in death a purpose perhaps more important than what they accomplished in war. They remind Americans that native languages and cultures are national treasures, not obstacles to progress.
On October 26, 1918, in a forest in France, 8 Choctaw soldiers picked up field telephones and spoke in their native language. In that moment, they changed military history forever. They weren't trained cryptographers. They hadn't studied encryption theory or code-breaking techniques. They were farmers and laborers from small Oklahoma towns who happened to be fluent in an ancient language that had survived centuries of displacement and suppression. Yet they created something that teams of professional intelligence officers couldn't, a communication system that was both instant and completely secure. They spoke, and the message was sent. No encryption time, no decryption time, no codes to memorize, no machines to maintain. Just human speech, in a language shaped by thousands of years of oral tradition. The Germans, who had broken every other American code, couldn't even identify what language they were hearing. To them, the Choctaw transmissions might as well have been alien communications from another planet. The Choctaw Code Talkers of World War I proved that indigenous knowledge could triumph over modern technology, that ancient wisdom had applications no one had imagined, that cultural diversity could be not just valuable, but essential to national survival. They did this despite everything, despite the Trail of Tears, despite the boarding schools, despite being denied full citizenship, despite returning to a nation that would continue to treat Native Americans as second-class citizens for decades to come. They served because they believed in something larger than themselves. They served because their warrior tradition demanded it. They served because, despite everything, they loved this land and were determined to defend it. As Carl Gorman, one of the original Navajo Code Talkers who learned from the Choctaw example, would later say, "We fought for our land because we loved the sacred mountains and valleys of our home. We fought for our people and our way of life. We fought in the hope that someday our children would walk in beauty and live in peace." That hope, born in the trenches of World War I and carried through decades of silence, represents the true legacy of the Choctaw Code Talkers. It is a legacy that speaks to the endurance of indigenous cultures, to the power of language to preserve identity, and to the complicated meaning of patriotism in a nation still grappling with its treatment of its first peoples. Today, when we talk about unbreakable codes, encrypted communications, and cybersecurity, we are using descendants of the tradition that began with those Choctaw soldiers.
Modern encryption has become exponentially more complex, but it still depends on the same principle they demonstrated, that language, in all its complexity and cultural specificity, can protect secrets and save lives. The Choctaw Code Talkers were the first. They proved it could work. They saved American lives. They helped win a war. And they did it by speaking their mother tongue, the language their children were beaten for speaking, the language the government had tried to erase, the language that survived because the Choctaw people refused to let it die. That language and the men who spoke it in the forests of France deserve to be remembered, not just as a footnote in military history, but as pioneers who demonstrated that the wisdom of ancient cultures could solve the problems of the modern world. The code was never broken, the language survived, and the legacy endures.